Well, it was Christmas time once again, and the Maatsuyker Canoe Club were off on its annual trip. This year we're going to visit the northwest coast, in particular Three Hummock Island. If we were lucky, we could also get to Albatross Island.
I think we'll need those today.
We'd arrived at Denham Hill about 1 o'clock. This allowed us about 2 hours to get our gear packed while we waited for the incoming tide. On the first day of our trip, we were heading for Davidson Bay, which is near Cape Grim. It was all sails up as we crossed between Kangaroo Island and the shoreline. At times our rudders were dragging on the bottom, but luckily it was exactly high tide as we went through between the island. After about an hour's sailing, we approached Woolnorth Point with Trefoil Island in the background. I ferry glided across the fast incoming tidal current to show the group the remains of the Collarboy, the coastal steamer that ran aground in 1932. Looking north towards Hunter Island, it was easy to appreciate just how strong the tidal currents are in this area, a fact that we would be reminded of in a few days when going to Albatross Island. We pulled into the shore at Davidson's Bay, where Phil and Laurie had camped on a previous trip. There is no water here, but it is sheltered from most winds. It had been an easy start to the trip, sailing all the way from Denham Hill. Hopefully tomorrow we will be able to visit Cape Grim and the Doughboys.
Oh, I don't know. Just go easy on. Just back to the package.
The weather forecast next day wasn't brilliant. A strong wind warning with a southwest change coming through later in the day. We decided to walk to Cape Grim to check out the sea conditions, then paddle down later. I was pleased with this decision as I wanted to take some panoramic photographs of Suicide Bay from Cape Grim and Mount Victory. Phil decided a bit of skinny dipping was in order, but the rest of us were not so sure. None of us were quite prepared for the spectacular views over Suicide Bay and from Mount Victory. It was here in 1828 that 4 shepherds from the Van Diemen's Land Company are reputed to have killed 30 Tasmanian Aborigines as they swam ashore after collecting mutton birds on the doughboys.
What is it?
Wind conditions were blustery, but sea conditions were ideal, so we headed back to get our kayaks.
That's interesting. The current shouldn't be going that way. It's all to do with the timing, isn't it?
Following winds assisted us towards the doughboys, and we were lucky to be able to get so close. This cave is one of the few places you can land on the doughboys. A quick circumnavigation of both doughboys, and we were headed for Suicide Bay, where we get a closer look at the cliffs and sea caves. The rock formations at Suicide Bay remind me of those on Steep Island. This area was once volcanically very active, with outpourings of lava and explosions of volcanic tuff. In all of the times we had visited Cape Grim, this was the first time we had been able to land in Suicide Bay, as the area is usually subject to big swells from the southwest. The smooth basalt pebbles on the beach were very slippery and hard to walk on. Plastic boats in particular needed to be prevented from sliding back down into the water. After a quick munch on some morning tea, we set off to explore some of the sea caves we had seen from the top of Mount Victory.
There's no bombs here.
We walked along the exposed wave-cut platform towards Cape Grim and an archway in the sea cliffs. A beautiful, deep, clear pool in front of the arch proved irresistible, and we jumped in despite the rather cool wind.
Who's next?
We intended camping at Cove Bay on Hunter Island tonight, and the last of the outgoing tide was still running, so we had following current for a while. Even after the tide had changed and was running against us, a freshening southwesterly allowed us to make good progress.
Yeah, we're going against the current now. Because it comes down between Stack and Beaver Point. Pardon? No, we're going along the coast now. Just go straight through the middle. A flotilla of sea kayaks.
Sea conditions became a bit lumpy between Stack and Hunter Islands as wind was against tide. But with the wind being stronger, we had some fun conditions. Pushing fully laden boats against the now rapidly incoming tide puts a lot of pressure on sails. The battens in Dave and my sails tore out on this leg of the journey. It looked like we would have to get out the sewing kit tonight and do a bit of maintenance. We set up camp in a sheltered spot just off the beach behind the bushes.
Is that enough? Yeah, that's good. I'm never going to believe.
Show me the pot.
Probably burned.
Now she got to swallow it now. Monday dawned overcast and calm. Today we were going to visit the big cave just to the north of Cove Bay and then trek inland to the homestead to see if Rick Lawrence was at home. Because the tide was in, we had to take the clifftop route to the cave entrance rather than clamber around the rocks. It was a bit scratchy, but the view from the top is worthwhile. According to archaeologists, the cave was occupied by Tasmanian Aborigines about 30,000 years ago.
Bogan's been here.
On with that, like what if you go, you wander off GPS guys, I might put this on my life jacket. It's just got an internal.
So someone else can go in first today because I don't want to find somebody dead on the back door.
So what did you just do with it?
The last time I was here, we had an alarming discovery. Rick Lawrence's father lay unconscious outside the house. We helped get him to a plane that took him to Smithton and learned later that unfortunately he died. Sarah and I walked up to a small graveyard on a hill near the house and discovered Rick's father's rather lonely grave. I like to see how Rick Lawrence's dad would be buried here. We returned to our kayaks at Cove Bay and set off for our next campsite at Shepherd's Bay, which is in the northern end of Hunter Island. It would be from here that we would make our attempt to get to Albatross Island. We had a light southeasterly blowing, enough to justify putting up our sails and drifting along.
Oh yeah, I see you got a back hook there. Yeah.
As we neared Shepherd's Bay, I realised that the tide and sea conditions were perfect for making a crossing to Albatross Island. We had an incoming tide that would sweep us out towards the island, and there was little or no swell. It was about 20 kilometres from here to the island. We had just enough time to get out there before dark. I suggested this to the group, but a few were apprehensive, worrying that if we couldn't land, we would have to paddle back in the dark past the dreaded dangerous bank. We opted to stick to our original plan, camp at Shepherd's Bay tonight, and head off over to Albatross Island tomorrow. The campsite at Shepherd's Bay is very sheltered in the bushes behind the beach, but at this time of the year it is plagued with mosquitoes. So we cooked our meal on the edge of the bay and enjoyed a pleasant evening.
Get a bit closer, you might be able to get a nostril head.
He's changed his mind. Jamie and Dave climbed the bluff on the northern end of the beach while we enjoyed a leisurely tea. We were up early on Tuesday, anxious to see what the weather and sea conditions were like. The sea had picked up a little, but there wasn't much wind, and the tide would take us out to Albatross Island. As we paddled along towards Cape Carodman, the rapidly incoming tide produced pressure waves, particularly on the end of the cape. Fairly typical conditions for a calm day out here. I was somewhat amused to see most of the group continue on out past the cape, heading due north. In fact, we needed to turn west if we were going to Albatross Island.
I don't know where they're going. I don't know where they're going. Head off the north side. Yeah. I'm about half a length in front. Well, it wasn't back there, was it? Oh, I wonder where you lot were going, to Melbourne or something. Heading out.
We would head north of the island to allow for the tide sweeping down the coast. I had been caught before, struggling to paddle against the current while trying to get to the landing spot on the northeast tip of the island. The only landing spot is in the small gulf, which is protected from westerly weather. Unfortunately, the swell was from the northeast.
Yes, we paddle back. Hey? No, that's not the place you land though. Sorry? That's not the place you land. Just round the corner.
It has to be quite calm before risking a landing, as the rocks are very jagged and slippery. We didn't want any broken bones out here. Reluctantly, we turned round and headed back to Three Hummock Island, 20 kilometres away. On the return journey, we passed close to dangerous banks. Jamie and Phil ventured even closer to the huge dumping waves that can be seen and heard over 10 kilometres away, even on calm days. It was mid-afternoon by the time we had completed our frustrating 40-kilometre paddle out to Albatross Island and back to Three Hummock Island. Time for a spot of lunch before visiting Rob Alliston at the Corners.
He's at it again.
We weren't quite sure what Sarah was practicing as she came into the beach, but it ended up as an escape and re-entry exercise.
And climb back in. Go for it. How can I make a decent sea kayaking video if nobody surfs?
Well, we did do a juicy bit before and he didn't.
Well, you're too quick.
After a rather cool lunch break, we left for Rob Alliston's home at Chimney Corner on the southwest corner of Three Hummock Island. Here we hope to replenish our water supplies and renew our acquaintances with Rob, who is running an eco-tourism venture on the island.
really care. She just...
Phil was trying to help Sarah retrieve a bottle that had slipped into the stern of her boat, but he couldn't quite get a grip on it with his feet.
Get back out again.
God, bloody thing! I can touch it.
Rob Alliston had very generously told us that we were welcome to come and camp in the shelter of the trees near his house, and to come up for a meal later that evening. Rob manages the island, which was once leased by his parents. Parks and Wildlife have introduced forester kangaroo onto the island as a means of preserving the species and to manage the grazing areas. The kangaroo are quite placid and graze fearlessly, even close to the tents and houses. Person, whoever it is.
The oil, Dave's oil. We can use it to smooth the ocean. Use to scald them or something.
27 cents or something for 10 minutes. We sound like that.
If you ring up Jan, you're going to ring up Jan.
Today we were going to climb South Hummock, the highest peak on Three Hummock Island. Rob had mentioned that Horseshoe Bay on the southern side of the island was also worth a visit, so we'd call in there in the afternoon for a refreshing swim. Before leaving on the walk, we inspected Rob's amphibious vehicle, which is currently up for sale.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Not every vehicle has no purpose inside the door, really.
Oh, it's got a toilet here too, wasn't it? Oh, in flight.
He recounted some adventurous stories of how the vehicle had proved unsuitable for navigating the treacherous tidal flows in these areas.
Yep.
He would be better off with a sea kayak.
They use these in the Antarctic division at one stage, didn't they?
They did.
Or something like that.
They're looking to use the old AMSA ones again now.
We strolled up to a high point overlooking the northwest corner of the island, keeping a sharp lookout for snakes as we pushed through the poa grass. From this vantage point you have a good view towards the Five Sisters and Hope Channel.
We went to, there's a guy called Ken Gillespie who was a ballet dancer in Launceston.
The 7-kilometre track to South Hummock runs behind the dunes before climbing the mountain.
Brine, I think, for a while.
Yeah,
and
you
then
got to pick it.
really oily.
Yeah, it's like it's high.
About 1.5 hours later, we were rewarded with a 360-degree panoramic view of Three Hummock Island and surrounding areas.
It takes a while for the sound to arrive.
Even from up here, 16 kilometres away, we could see the fearsome breakers on dangerous banks.
The nut would be too far away.
No, you can see it through there. Come around a bit.
We were quite hot after climbing the hummock, so most of us were looking forward to a swim at Horseshoe Bay. While some were in swimming, Jamie disappeared, and later, when we got back to Chimney Corner, we found that his tent and kayak were gone. A note explained that he had decided to return home earlier than expected. This was of some concern until we contacted him by mobile phone and realised he was safe and sound. The intention was to head east to Neil Rocks on the southern side of the island, before crossing to the Petrel Islands on the northern end of Walker Island.
Behind the camera. Do you think we'll be able to land on the stony or the big sandy island?
Well, I was hoping that we would, but this morning we studied maps and books while waiting to say our farewells to Rob. The weather was sunny and windy, with a strong wind warning. The intention was to head east to Neil Rocks on the southern side of the island, before crossing to the Petrel Islands on the northern end of Walker Island, and then down to camp at Mosquito Inlet. At Sandy Spit, we left the shelter of the island and felt the full force of the northeast winds. Some members were concerned about crossing to Petrel Island with wind and tide against us. Rob and Phil decided to push on, as Natalie will be waiting for them at Denham Hill. We said our farewells and turned to run back with the wind around to the Five Sisters beach. We would head north up the sheltered western shores to Burgess Point.
So the current was definitely going against us around that corner. Rock cod.
We cruised quite leisurely past Five Sisters Beach and up to Burgess Point, where we stopped for some lunch and a look at some unusual granite rock formations near Bears Island. We negotiated some narrow passages between rocks on Burgess Point before gritting our teeth and heading out around Burgess Point. We slogged into a strong northeast headwind across West Telegraph Beach, but eventually reached the relatively sheltered northern corner of Coulomb Bay. The geographical names in this region reflect the fact that the first trans-bass telegraph cable came ashore here on Three Hummock Island in 1859. The only reasonable place to put up our tents was on the beach, Areas of lush green grass nearby were wet and heavily infested with jackjumpers and ants. We cooked in the shelter of granite boulders and then reflected on the day's events while watching the sunset. We were all wondering if Phil and Rob had made it safely to Walker Island against the wind and tide. The wind was still howling in from the northeast next day, precluding our plan of circumnavigating Three Hummock Island. Some local yachties had told us the day before that there was a good campsite just north of Ranger Point, on the other side from where we were camped. We decided to check out the area for future trips. After a few minutes paddling, we were in Ranger's Retreat, and it was certainly a sheltered little cove. We had been told that the abalone poacher Campbell Strawn had used this area as a base camp. We found his iron barbecue grate chained to some rocks.
That's getting a bit serious. I think we're in the corner.
I found an unusual rock formation called Mother and Child by Eleanor Alliston, Rob's mother, a former resident on the island for 40 years. With some reluctance, we decided to sail back to Chimney Corner, hoping that the wind would moderate the next day and that Rob wouldn't mind us staying on an extra night. We had an extremely quick trip back to Burgess Point, with sails flying before the strong winds.
Really woke up? Oh, it's a big
Yeah.
So shelter compared to that now.
Sorry.
If anything, the wind had increased considerably since the day before, and it wasn't looking promising for the rest of the trip. Surprise, surprise! Guess who we found back at Chimney Corner? We spent that afternoon in Rob's veggie patch, mulching his garden. A small thank you for his kindness and generosity. During our gardening activities, we did find out that Sarah had a mint fetish. Saturday morning, and the weather had improved. With Natalie arriving at Denham Hill today, Phil was anxious to move on. We still had a few days to potter around the islands. As a newcomer to sea kayaking, Rob was still somewhat apprehensive about the weather, and Dave gave him some light-hearted ribbing about the possible conditions they might expect.
Hey Rob, white caps are picked up again? White caps are picked up again? Will do. Thanks, Jeff.
See you around.
Yeah. Thanks for having me along. It's been really good.
That's great. As they set sail, we could see that the wind had moderated and that it looked good for crossing to Walker Island. We once again trod the path up to the hilltop for a peaceful look over to Five Sisters Beach and Hunter Island. It is easy to see why the Allistons consider themselves millionaires, even if they weren't rich. Well, today we were off to Stack Island, a small island off the southeast tip of Hunter Island. This is a favourite campsite of the Maatsuyker Canoe Club. From here it is usually an easy trip back to Robin's Passage, if you get the tide right. It was about 20 kilometres to Stack Island, and after waiting for a favourable tide, we set sail. With the moderate northeasterly, we had an easy trip down the eastern coast of Hunter Island. The sea was somewhat lumpy, but no problem. Near Stack Island, the tide was really racing in, taking us down to the campsite. Landing near the campsite is a little tricky. You have to negotiate a narrow rocky channel between Dugay Islets and Stack Island, and then head straight towards what appears to be a totally rocky shore. A narrow channel that has been cleared of rocks gives access to the beach at high tide. One of the deck fastenings on Sue's boat had pulled out when we carried the heavily laden boat up to the beach. It was pouring with rain as we awoke next morning, a somewhat dismal finish to the trip. However, by the time we had packed up and were ready to go, the weather was clearing. The Bureau was predicting a southwesterly change, which would be excellent for sailing if it happened.
It's going to come out sunny.
It can be quite difficult getting back to the starting point in Robin's Passage, as the coastline here is very flat with very few distinguishing features.
Quite an interesting light, isn't it? When, like, look at the colours on the here.
My plan was to head off on a bearing of 115 degrees magnetic and paddle for about 1 hour before heading south towards Robin's Passage. After paddling for a short while, we had some luck with the weather. The southwest change came in, and with freshening winds we had an excellent sail all the way back to the cars at Denham Hill.
Just about aim for Denham Hill. It's when you start seeing cows you get worried. We'll sail as far as we can sail. The end!